Today is December 21st, 2022. I want to talk about the situation in and around the Ukrainian or Russian city of Bakhmut, depending on your perspective. I recently did a live stream with Gonzalo, Lira. It also included Dima of the Military Summary channel and Alex of History Legends. We talked about why Bakhmut mattered. Why is the Western media making such a big deal out of this? The link to that discussion will be in the video description below. It was about 2 hours long, so I want to do a shorter, more focused version of my comments regarding Bakhmut. So where is Bakhmut? So let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is pro-Ukrainian, so keep that in mind when looking at it. So this is all of Ukraine. This is the eastern region or western Russia, again, depending on your perspective. And Bakhmut is right here along the line of contact, right here. And Bakhmut, as you can see, has all kinds of roads and rails leading in and out of it in all directions. It is an essential transportation hub. It is also part of a very significant Ukrainian defense line. So Bakhmut here in the middle goes up to Siversk. To the north, there is Soledar. And it goes all the way down to Adivka, which is right here. And this is one of the primary areas Ukraine has been shelling the civilian population of Donetsk city since 2014. So breaking through and destroying this massive, very significant Ukrainian defense line. This is part of demilitarizing Ukraine. Punching a hole through this defensive line at Bakhmut will allow Russia to attack Ukrainian defenses along axes that Ukrainian forces are not necessarily well prepared to defend against. And the same thing happened at Popasna when this was before Russia took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. They took Popasna and then they were able to roll up much of that defensive line that Ukraine had created. It was very heavily defended areas, but they were being attacked along axes they were not prepared to defend against. The same situation might, and I stress might, happen if and when Russia takes Bakhmut, punches a hole through this defensive line. Now, as Dima and Alex pointed out in the live stream, this was just yesterday, if you look at Bakhmut here, you will notice that there is a main road that goes to a large town or city called Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is an essential logistics hub. It is supplying troops to the front line. Over time, Russia has attacked Pokrovsk with long-range precision weapons. This is from AP. Russian rockets hit eastern Ukrainian town of Pokrovsk. And they make it out as if Russia is just terrorizing the civilian population there. This was back in May. This is a pro-Ukrainian news source, Ukrinform. And this was from September, so a little more recently. And they are reporting that Iskander missiles hit rail infrastructure as well as what is clearly an industrial building of some sort, a warehouse or a repair facility of some kind. That's what Pokrovsk is. It is a logistics hub for the rest of the front line. This is one of the places Ukrainian forces will be retreating back to. Also Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And then the line will move up to these towns and cities. This has been the pattern since this began in late February. Now, let's talk about Bakhmut. Most recently, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visited Bakhmut. And this is from PBS NewsHour, but actually Associated Press. Zelensky visits front line in Bakhmut while Putin praises troops in Kremlin. Let's listen to this article. It says, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the eastern city of Bakhmut, the scene of some of the most intense combat since Russia invaded the country, meeting Tuesday with troops and praising their courage, resilience, and strength as artillery boomed in the background. And then it says, Russian President Vladimir Putin also hailed the courage and self-denial of his forces in Ukraine, but he did so at a ceremony in an opulent and glittering hall at the Kremlin. And what they're telling you here by reporting it this way is that this is all about optics. And you only worry about optics when something is going very badly that you want to portray as going better than it actually is. So that is what this visit was all about, and that's what articles like this are all about. And I just want to remind people that President Zelensky often visits cities right before they fall. This was back in June. Vladimir Zelensky visits frontline cities as Russia resumes strikes on Ukraine's capital, Kiev. And it says, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has visited Lysychansk and Soledar, two cities close to some of the most intense fighting between his country's troops and Russian forces. So does that sound familiar? Do you see the pattern developing here? So that in reality, because they're trying to portray this visit as a sign of strength, that Ukraine is not worried about Bakhmut falling, so much so that President Zelensky will go there and visit. But as I pointed out, he often visits cities to create the illusion of strength when in fact it is about to collapse, as was the case with Lysychansk. Now, we do know that Ukraine is losing territory in Bakhmut to Russian forces. That is a reality. That is something that even the Pentagon has admitted to. This is just yesterday, December 20th, 2022. This is from the U.S. Department of Defense. Brigadier General Pat Ryder, Pentagon press secretary, holds a press briefing. And this is what he said when asked about the situation in Bakhmut. He says, as far as Bakhmut goes, we continue to see intense fighting in the region of Bakhmut, with the Russian forces making very incremental gains. And we're talking feet. And you know, again, the fighting has been intense for a while there. So our focus from a DoD standpoint is to continue to communicate with Ukraine, our allies and our partners, to ensure the Ukrainians have the security assistance they need to be successful on the battlefield. Well, if they were providing what they needed, Russia wouldn't be moving forward even feet. They would be moving backwards, and probably significantly so, if the West was able to provide Ukraine what it actually needed. And this is the rhetoric that I have been pointing out, going over these press briefings from the Pentagon for months. This is how it always goes. They try to deride Russia for its slow progress, but it is still progress. And this is exactly what they were talking about before Russia took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and also before that, Mariupol. The situation in Bakhmut looks bleak, and it's not based on just a single comment during a Pentagon press briefing. If you go across the Western media, you are going to see that it is full of hints of how the situation actually is unfolding in Bakhmut. So this is an article from The Times. Ice cold test of resolve in Ukraine's meat grinder. And the article says the battle for the city began in August as Russian regular troops, spearheaded by private mercenaries from the Wagner Group, pushed from the east to try to capture it. The battle is now at its climax, an attritional struggle of massed artillery barrages along a stretch of front known to the soldiers as the meat grinder, where thousands of troops from both sides have been killed or wounded in what is emerging as the bloodiest clash since the war began. As the Russians seek to outflank Bakhmut by attacking to its north in Soledar and to the south, frontal assaults have begun on the streets at the edge of the city itself. Then it admits, despite hideous casualties and the slow loss of ground around Bakhmut, morale among Ukrainian forces remained high, though the sense of exhaustion, especially among infantrymen on the east side, was palpable. So this is the Times again, just like the Pentagon, admitting that Ukraine is losing ground. They're also admitting that Ukraine is suffering heavy casualties. And they also tried to suggest that Russia is also, but there is no evidence that they're actually presenting to substantiate that claim. Now, we were told by the Western media that Ukraine turned the tide of this war with the offensive in Kherson and Kharkov and retaking this territory back from Russia, Russian forces being depleted, in disarray, on the retreat. We were told that the tide has turned in Ukraine's favor. And yet here at Bakhmut, where they clearly are investing absolutely everything they can spare to try to hold the city, they are still losing territory, and they are losing huge amounts in terms of casualties. How is that possible if the tide actually turned in Ukraine's favor? Now, as I pointed out, those offensives were last-ditch, desperate acts to try to make something happen before Ukraine's fighting capacity collapsed entirely. That's what we're watching. They expended that reserve, taking back territory around Kharkov, attempting to take territory around Kherson. They lost those men. They lost that equipment. They are unable to rebuild a reserve like that. Now their forces are stretched too thin. Their offensives have stopped absolutely everywhere else. And at critical points along the front line, like Bakhmut city, they are actually losing territory. The Times also says, the crash of Russian artillery surpasses that of the Ukrainians by a ratio of at least 6-to-1. And casualties in this sector run at a daily rate of scores of men, sometimes hundreds, across an area that in some places has begun to resemble the shell-churned landscape of the First World War. All throughout this conflict, the Western media, even though they don't put this in the headlines or at the top of their articles, buried deep within their accounts of the fighting across Ukraine, they admit that Russia has consistently outgunned Ukraine in every respect, outgunned and outfought them. And in this case, they're admitting that in Bakhmut, they outgunned Ukraine by at least 6-to-1. So when you hear these claims that Ukraine may be suffering heavy casualties, but Russia is suffering just as many casualties, how is that possible if Russia has Ukraine outgunned 6-to-1? It doesn't make any sense. It's something that they have to say to make it look less desperate than it actually is. Just like President Zelensky visiting Bakhmut, that is the reason why they're doing it. They're trying to delay the inevitable, the realization of how desperate the situation is in Ukraine. Now, here's another article. This is from Wall Street Journal. Comes to us via MSN. Battle for Bakhmut is critical test of Russia's prospects in Ukraine. This is what this article says. From the military standpoint, Bakhmut doesn't have strategic significance. The commander of Ukrainian land forces, Colonel General Alexander Sursky, said in a Ukrainian TV appearance this month. But at the same time, it has psychological significance. And we know that actually strategically it has great significance, but also psychological and political significance. Indeed, a retreat from Bakhmut would signal Ukraine losing the initiative after 4 months of steady advances, raising Russian morale and making it harder to pursue further Ukrainian offensives in Donetsk and the nearby Lugansk region. That is why, in the past 3 weeks, Ukraine has saturated the area with fresh troops and equipment. So again, they're admitting that this is, even if they want to say it has no importance, they are admitting that it's important just through the actions of Ukraine, them flooding the city with additional troops and equipment. And you wouldn't be flooding it with additional troops and equipment if you weren't losing huge amounts of men and equipment in the first place. They're admitting how important it is to portray Ukraine as still having the advantage over Russia, continuing the perceived momentum that they gained during those two offensives, Kharkov and Kherson. And it's so dire for them to maintain this illusion that they are going to continue pouring, as they say, fresh troops and equipment into Bakhmut. But we remember what Russia's primary objective is in all of this. It is to demilitarize Ukraine. And instead of Ukrainian forces making it as difficult as possible for Russian forces to reach and engage with and destroy Ukrainian troops, they are feeding Ukrainian troops into Russian artillery. That is what's happening at Bakhmut. That is the definition of demilitarization. Feeding your forces into a battlefield where you are outgunned 6-1 by the enemy's artillery. That is demilitarization. Now here is a Reuters article. Analysis. Russia's grim battle for Bakhmut may yield Pyrrhic victory at best. We've heard this over and over again, from Mariupol to Severodonetsk to Lysychansk. Anywhere where Russia is making gains, the Western media dismisses it as insignificant. Even if they win, it doesn't matter because everything is destroyed. Mariupol is now being rebuilt. They've made significant progress. Life is returning to normal there. So again, keep in mind that this is what the Western media does. This is propaganda. This is what the article says. Gaining control of the city with a pre-war population of 70 to 80,000 that has shrunk to close to 10,000 could give Russia a stepping stone to advance on two bigger cities, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. It would also deprive Ukraine of a useful road and rail supply line intersection, but with fierce fighting there since August 1st and Russian shelling since May, much of Bakhmut lies in ruins, while Ukrainian forces to the west have had ample time to build defensive lines nearby to fall back to, so that you wouldn't be building these defense lines if you were confident you would be able to hold the city. You would be building these defense lines because you know it's inevitable that you will lose the city. And as I've pointed out, these defensive lines have been built up since 2014, 2015. They are extensive. What Ukraine is able to build as they're falling back will be less significant. And this was the same situation that happened around Popasna. It isn't as if the Ukrainians didn't think to retrench further back. It's just that those fortifications are always going to be less significant than something you've been able to prepare over the course of 8 years. On casualties, Reuters says, neither side discloses the full extent of fatalities in Ukraine, but Kiev says Russia has been taking heavy losses and that many of those killed were convicts recruited by Moscow's Wagner private mercenary company. They talk about Prigozhin, Wagner's founder, who is sanctioned in the West, has confirmed his men are fighting there. Prigozhin has cautioned against expecting rapid breakthroughs, and in a December 12th comment said Wagner's task in fighting for Bakhmut was to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible and bleed the Ukrainian army dry. Demilitarization. So that is the supposed head of Wagner admitting that this isn't about taking territory. Do not expect a breakthrough. The purpose of this battle is attrition, bleeding the Ukrainian army dry. And that is exactly what's happening. According to the Western media itself, that is what's happening. Reuters also says, with Ukraine having scored a string of battlefield successes, even a relatively insignificant defeat risks creating the perception of stalemate, which could make Western countries less willing to extend support for Kiev amid their own mounting economic problems stemming from the war. So again, it's all about perception management. The inability, not for Western governments, they're all in. This is their project. This is their proxy war. It's about convincing the Western public, justifying the economic catastrophe that is unfolding, especially in Europe, while still sending billions of dollars in support to Ukraine. And again, they're referring to Ukraine's string of battlefield successes. They're talking about Kharkov and Kherson. And again, as I pointed out, that was not the beginning of a greater Ukrainian victory. That was the beginning of the end of Ukraine's forces, the beginning of the irreversible collapse of their fighting capacity. Now, we have another article here. We have this article from New York Times, Russia's battle for Bakhmut. The city in the Donbass has become a destructive vortex for Ukrainian and Russian forces. But again, remember, the Times is reporting, admitting that Russia outguns Ukraine 6-1. So it is always going to be a destructive vortex, much more so for Ukraine than for Russia. The New York Times reports, Ukraine has sent floods of reinforcements, including special forces, troops, and territorial defense fighters, according to soldiers, local residents, and a U.S. defense official. It has also deployed large quantities of Western-supplied shells and rockets. So their best soldiers and their best equipment is going to Bakhmut. This is who they are going there to fight. This is what the New York Times says. Russia's fighting force in Bakhmut is led by Wagner Group, a private mercenary outfit with direct ties to the Kremlin. After Russia's retreat from Kherson earlier this month, rank-and-file forces redeployed from the south and are now supporting Wagner Group fighters, according to a U.S. defense official and Ukrainian soldiers. So in other words, the absolute best troops and equipment that Ukraine has is going to fight Wagner. And many Western sources are claiming that most of these Wagner fighters are criminals. They're convicts that have been let out of jail to go fight in or against Ukraine. The article says, analysts say that Russia's military is unlikely to succeed in capturing Bakhmut, given the degradation of its forces and ammunition shortages after a series of setbacks. That is debatable, and the source of these experts they're citing is most likely the Institute for the Study of War, and anyone who is familiar with this think tank knows that it really is just a war propaganda mill. Still, Russia can turn the city into a resource-intensive black hole for Ukraine, taking troops away from other priorities, including future offensives. That is exactly the point. The point is not to take the city. The point is to suck as much of Ukraine's military, the best of Ukraine's military, into the city to be destroyed. That is exactly what is happening. The article concludes by talking about the stockpiles, the weapons and ammunition stockpiles for both Russia and Ukraine. They claim both are running low. But we only have evidence that Ukraine's stockpiles are running low. They're outgunned 6-1 because their weapons and ammunition are running low. They keep claiming that Russia is running low. Maybe they are relative to what they started with. Maybe. Maybe not. No evidence is provided to substantiate this claim. I just want to reiterate one more time. These offensives that Ukraine launched into Kherson, into Kharkov, to take all of this territory back from Russia, it was a failure in the sense that they were unable to encircle and destroy Russian forces. Russian forces fell back. They did not stay and fight to the death. They preserved their fighting capacity, and as they fell back, they used their advantage in long-range artillery, rockets, missiles, military aviation. They used this to destroy Ukrainian forces that were out in the open as part of these offensives. They destroyed brigades worth of men and materiel that Ukraine had accumulated for these offensives. They have exhausted that reserve, and we just saw Ukrainian General Valery Zaluzhny begging for hundreds of tanks, hundreds more infantry fighting vehicles, heavily armored fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers. And then you have to imagine all of the ammunition that has to go along with all of this equipment that he's asking for. The West simply does not have this to give Ukraine. They exhausted their reserves. The West has nothing left to send them, and we can see that Ukrainian forces are stretched thin. They are not on the offensive anywhere else, and where they are on the defensive, they are losing ground. That is a dire indication of just how bad things are going for Ukraine right now. We are going to watch desperate battles like this unfold one after the other until Ukraine's fighting capacity completely collapses. That is what we're going to watch. This is the same situation Germany was in at the end of World War II and after the Ardennes offensive, where they took this huge reserve that they had on hand. They threw it into this one last-ditch offensive. It failed, and then they fought one desperate battle after the other all the way back to Berlin, and all the way until their ultimate defeat. We're going to have to keep an eye on this. They will fall back from Bakhmut. They will go to Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and beyond. We'll just have to keep an eye on this as it develops, and keep an eye on how the Western media's narrative evolves. Just as it did around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, we're going to watch the same stages of denial and eventual acceptance, and then memory holding that the West always does in a situation like this. So if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to Rumble and Odyssey. It might take a day or two, but they'll show up there. Subtitles for my YouTube videos will show up in a day or two. They're auto-generated. I have no control over how quickly or slowly that happens, but they will eventually show up. Thank you for your patience. All of the links that I reference in this video are in the video description, as well as ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, please feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping me support my work, whether it's month to month, one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, I greatly appreciate that. I could not do this work without that support. And as always, thank you for watching.